This year, there will be no budget presented by the Republicans or the Democrats. I think that's a bad idea. I think the government should have a budget, should have a document that says what we're for, what we're against, and how we're going to spend our money. I think it's particularly important because we're incurring so much debt. You may remember that Republicans campaigned against enormous spending by President Obama and trillion-dollar annual deficits. Now we're faced with enormous spending and trillion-dollar annual deficits from Republicans. I think it is important that we have a discussion over this. Do we have too much debt? Now, some will say, well, I have debt for my house, and that's not bad. The country has a lot of debt that they borrow against capital expenditures, things that don't expire. I think there's some truth to that. So you can have a manageable amount of debt, particularly if it's against something that you're borrowing that doesn't go away. But if you're borrowing money for the grocery store or for your apartment, that might be a bad thing. It won't last very long. You'll do it a month or two, and pretty soon the bank will come calling. So there is a point at which debt is too cumbersome and there's too much of it. Carmen Reinhardt of the University of Maryland and Kenneth Rogoff of Harvard did a study linking debt to economic growth. They concluded that when a country exceeds 90% of their GDP, when their debt is almost equal to their GDP, that economic growth begins to slow and you lose probably 1 to 2 points just because of the burden of this debt. This is all of the debt. What does the government owe to the public at large and to theirself? They say when it exceeds 90%, it's a problem. Well, currently our debt is at 105%. So our gross public debt is 105% of our GDP. So we now have a national debt of about $21 trillion. Historically, Congress had sort of a cover on this. Congress would try to rein in the debt, and there would be a big debate every time we had raised the debt ceiling. Congress has to lift it each time, and there was some punishment out there for those who voted to raise the debt ceiling. Now we don't raise the debt ceiling any longer a certain amount because that became embarrassing and limiting and made them come back each time to try to raise the debt ceiling. So now what we do is we raise it for a period of time. Currently, the debt ceiling has been raised, and you can spend as much as you want for a little over a year. We did it, I believe, back in December. It's about a year and a half. The government can simply borrow as much as they can possibly borrow in that period of time. Basically, there is no limit. The debt ceiling vote has become a meaningless vote because we just raise it for a period of time. Is the debt a problem? How much interest do we pay on the debt? We pay about $300 billion in interest. You say, well, is that a problem? Well, yeah, interest crowds out other things that you want from government. So when people come to my office and say, I want this from government, I say, well, part of the problem is we're paying $300 billion in interest. Or part of the problem is we don't have to give you because we're borrowing about 25% of every dollar we spend. So every time the government spends a dollar, 25% of that is borrowed. And this is on current accounts of things that people want. So for example, if I were to ask you, is it a good idea to borrow money to give to your church? Well, people would say, well, my church is a good thing, and I want to give money to my church, but is it a good idea, and will it last very long if you go to the bank to borrow 25% of every dollar you spend and give tithe 25% to your church? You say, well, my church is a good thing, but is it a good thing to borrow that money? And will a bank keep loaning you that money, and are there repercussions to having so much debt? Now, we have a $300 billion interest payment at about 2% interest. The interest is basically manipulated by the Federal Reserve, and there are those who report that the main reason the interest rates are kept low by the Federal Reserve is not necessarily to stimulate economic growth, it's to finance this enormous burden of debt. What happens when interest rates normalize? And many are predicting they will. As economic growth begins to pick up, you're going to see an acceleration in interest rates. What happens at 5%? Can we even manage our debt at 5%? People have looked at what the interest will be, even saying interest rates stay stable, and they say within about a decade, interest rates will exceed all other payments in the government. The estimate is within 10 years, interest alone will be about $761 billion, greater than national defense, greater than any other area of the budget. Even now, the second biggest item in the budget after defense is interest. So some say, but we have to finance the military and the military needs more money. That's why you hear Republicans now no longer caring about the debt, is that they got more money for the military. But they had to make an unholy alliance with Democrats and give them more for social welfare. So we got guns and butter. Everybody gets what they want except for the taxpayer, or those of us who care about the debt. So the debt has exploded now under Republican control. And you say, well, don't we need it for military? Well, I think there are some arguments that we should probably engage in before we decide that. We have doubled the amount in nominal terms that we spend on the military since 9/11. In real terms, about a 36% increase in national defense. We spend more on the military than the next 8 countries combined. So there is an argument that it isn't necessarily the budget is not grown enough, it's that maybe the military mission is too large. Maybe it's not that the budget is too small, but our military mission is too large, that we're at war in too many places around the globe, and that we should reassess that. People will often argue, many Republicans will say, well, that's all good and well, but the culprit is entitlements. Entitlements are growing at 6%. Social Security, Medicare, food stamps. There's truth to that, but watch closely the people who tell you that the problem is entitlements and ask yourself, are they doing anything to fix entitlements? Ask them, have they put forward a bill onto the floor of the Senate to rein in spending and entitlements? Ask them if they've even co-sponsored a bill or if they're agitating for a bill to rein in entitlements. No, they're petrified of looking at entitlements, so everybody complains about it and nobody does anything about it, and everybody says they're for a balanced budget. And yet when we have a vote in a few minutes on a budget that actually balances in 5 years, consistent with the balanced budget amendment, I think we'll get a handful, maybe a dozen or maybe 2 dozen. But the majority of Republicans will say, oh my goodness, we could never cut spending. So in the abstract, they're for a balanced budget. They're for a balanced budget amendment. They all vote for it. They all come down here. We had a nearly unanimous vote. I think we had a unanimous vote a few years ago. Republicans all voted for the balanced budget amendment. Just a month ago in the House, all the people who voted to bust the budget caps, all the people that voted for the extra spending, all these Republicans then voted for the balanced budget amendment, which says you have to balance in 5 years. Typically, when they've brought forward a budget, they've tried to balance in 10 years and struggled. So they vote for a balanced budget amendment that balances in 5, and yet they struggle to come up with a budget that's not fake to balance in 10. We passed a budget last year. It was a Republican budget. I voted against it because I think it had fake cuts in it, and it had fake reporting, and they weren't serious about it. I'll give you an example. The budget last year that Republicans passed had about $4 trillion in entitlement savings over 10 years. You say, well, did they enact any of that? Zero. Do they have any bills to do any entitlement for? Zero. Did we ever debate and vote on any bills that would have done anything to entitlement spending? No. In fact, in the first year of the Republican budget last year, there was $96 billion. That's a significant savings, all in entitlements, and yet nobody had a bill that even went to committee. There was never a committee vote. There was never a floor vote. No one lifted a finger to do anything about entitlement spending. So it is a canard for those who say, well, the real problem is not military. The real problem is not non-military discretion. The real problem is entitlements. Sure, entitlements are growing faster, but unless we're doing something about it, it's simply saying, oh, we got to keep spending over here because the real problem's over here, but we're not going to do anything over here. That runs into really the hypocrisy that we face today. I've often said that the Republican Party is an empty vessel unless we imbue it with value. We say we are against big spending. We say we are against big government. We say we are for devolving power and structure and money back to the states, and yet the government grows under Democrats and it grows under Republicans. Democrats are sometimes more honest about wanting to grow government. They'll go home and say they're going to make government big enough to put a ham on every table, a chicken in every pot. They're a little bit more honest about it. Republicans go home and say they believe in the free market, and they go to the Rotary Club and say, I voted for the balanced budget amendment. And yet the question is, why won't they vote for an actual budget that balances? Why won't they vote for a budget that actually is consistent with the balanced budget amendment? So what I've done is put forward my own budget. It's something that I've talked about for several years now. It wasn't originally my idea, but others have talked about it. It's called the penny plan. It says that we would cut 1 penny out of every dollar the federal government spends. 1%. Could we not get to a point where we could actually cut 1 penny out of every dollar? Isn't there enough waste going on in government that we could actually cut a penny out of every dollar? But like everything else, people argue the numbers, and there's a lot of fake math that goes on around here. And what they will say, those on the left will say, oh, but this will be cutting $13 trillion, when in fact it might not cut any. So for example, if we were to freeze government spending for 10 years, the left would say you've cut spending by $15 trillion because we were going to increase spending by $15 trillion. So it's sort of fake accounting. If we spend $3.2 trillion and next year we spend $30 billion less or $32 billion less, that's a 1% cut. But the left will say, oh no, we were going to increase spending by 6%, and so you're really cutting spending by 7%. And this enormous number comes up, but in reality, we're taking last year's spending, $3.2 trillion, we're going to cut it by 1%, $30 billion. We do that every year for 5 years, and the budget balances. And you say, well, some people might not get all their money. Yep, there would be some programs across government that would get less. I want any American, I challenge any American to call up my office and present proof that there's not 1% waste and fraud in any program going on. I'll give you an example. The Earned Income Tax Credit and the Child Tax Credit are estimated to have 25% fraud. For years, you could get this credit without a Social Security number. You could simply say, myself and my kids, we don't have one. The government would generate a taxpayer ID number for you and give you a refund. This is to the tune of billions of dollars. It's about $100 billion in the EITC, the Earned Income Tax Credit, and the Additional Child Credit. Many of it was going to people who were in our country illegally and had no Social Security number. There is waste from top to bottom in government. How would you ever find it? See, many people in this body on both sides of the aisle will say, I'm for rooting out waste. And yet, you never find waste if you keep giving them more money. If you reward government agencies with more money, you're never going to get less waste. So the penny plan budget that I'm presenting would cut 1%. Does anybody in America think that government couldn't do with 1% less? Many American families have had a bad year here and there and have had to deal with more than 1% less. But 1% of this enormous government, if it were cut each year, I think we'd go a long way towards making us a stronger nation. People say, well, what about the military? I think if the government ran a balanced budget, we would have a stronger and more secure nation. Admiral Mullen said that he thought the #1 threat to our national security was actually our debt. So there are many realistic people, even high-ranking people in the military who are saying, you know what? If we want to secure our nation, we have to make sure that we have a sound economy and that we have a sound government that is not borrowing so much money. How rapidly do we borrow money? We borrow $1 million every minute. $1 million a minute. In fact, it's a little bit higher than that now. It's about 1.5 million, and the curve over the next 10 years gets to about $2 million a minute. Imagine how fast the money is flying out of here. How big is $1 million? People have said that if you put $100 bills in your hand, it's about 4 inches high to get to $1 million. But we're borrowing $1 million or more every minute. So if we said, how would we get to $30 billion? How could we possibly cut $30 billion from the budget? I'll give you an example of where some of the money is. Foreign aid's about $30 billion. And you say, well, I want to help the poor people of the world. I'm all for you. If you want to give out of your savings to help poor people around the world, all the benefit and all the accolades for being generous. But if you want to borrow money, you won't be able to do it very long. Should the U.S. government borrow? We're going to borrow $1 trillion this year. Should we borrow money to send it to poor countries? Or should we borrow money to send armaments to countries? I think it's a big mistake. That's about $30 billion. So if you were to cut 1% next year, you could actually cut 1% by simply eliminating foreign aid. How much do we spend in Afghanistan building their roads, building their bridges, building their schools before they blow them up again, and then we rebuild them again? We've rebuilt some buildings 7 times in Afghanistan. That's nearly $50 billion. That's about a year, year and a half of the penny plan right there. If you were to say, guess what, we won the Afghan war, and we're not going to stay forever, and we have some needs here at home that we're going to take care of and not send all that money to Afghanistan. Corporate welfare. Rich corporations in our country, I'm all for them. If they freely sell something to you and they make money because you like their product and they buy it, more power to them. But if they want money from the federal government, that's ridiculous. I don't think private business should be getting any money from the federal government. It's estimated that corporate welfare is over $100 billion. I know for certain we could find enough corporate welfare that we could actually, by eliminating corporate welfare, do 1 year of the penny plan. Waste, our office alone has found $3 billion in waste. Interest, $300 billion going up to $760 billion. There's a lot of areas of our government that we could actually look at and actually adhere to the penny plan and balance our budget. I'd like to go through a few items. If there is anybody in America who believes that your government's not wasting your money, I'd like to show you a few areas where your government is wasting your money. My staff recently went to Afghanistan, and this is a picture of a luxury hotel that your taxpayer dollars went to build. Now, your first question might be, why would your taxpayer dollars be going to a luxury hotel in some third world country? So it's about 400 feet from our embassy, and this is what it looks like. They've been building it for 11 years. It's unfinished. Nothing was done to code. It's falling down. And at this point, the hotel is so dangerous that we have to send our soldiers up to patrol it to make sure snipers aren't using the hotel to shoot at our embassy. So it's not only a waste of $90 million, never having been completed, it's now a danger to our troops. The talk now, how are they going to fix their problem? Does anybody in Washington think we should spend less on Afghanistan? Virtually no one. Both sides of the aisle, Republicans and Democrats, can't spend money fast enough in Afghanistan. No one is making a stand and saying enough's enough. It's time to announce that we won and it's time to come home. The money just keeps going, good money after bad. $90 million for a hotel that will never be built. And to add insult to injury, you know what they're going to do now? They're talking about selling the unfinished hotel. You know who they're going to sell it to? Another branch of government. So government built this, U.S. taxpayer dollars built this, now they're going to sell it to the State Department. You know what the State Department's going to do with this luxury hotel in Kabul? They're going to tear it down. So $90 million flushed down the toilet. You can't tell me that this waste isn't rotting in our government from top to bottom and it's never rooted out. Why? Because we never give any agency less money. Everybody gets more money. If you're running an agency or a business and someone gives you more money, are you more likely to root out waste or less likely to root out waste? The only way they'd ever root out waste is if they got a commandment, thou shalt do this, from Congress, from the Senate to say enough's enough, let's declare victory and come home. $90 million flushed down the toilet. It's now a danger to our troops, and they're going to tear it down, never completed. Also in Afghanistan, there's been brand new equipment that we send over there that's shredded. They have big, huge industrial shredders. My staff saw them. They found boxes of new equipment, electrical outlet boxes, all kinds of things, being shoved into the shredder. So we buy brand new equipment, it's shoved in the shredder. $50 million of brand new, never used equipment has been destroyed. This doesn't even count the old stuff we're destroying. There are reports it's $7 billion, seven with a B, billion dollars of used equipment. Tanks, Humvees, etc. have been destroyed. Why? Our allies are so unreliable, we're afraid if we leave a tank or a Humvee there, it might be taken by the opposition and used against us. So we've destroyed $7 billion because it's cheaper to destroy it than to load it back up on planes and bring it back over here. $7 billion. Department of Defense loses $29 million of heavy equipment. What does that mean? Can't find them, can't be accounted, don't know where the equipment is. $29 million unaccounted for in heavy equipment. They tried to establish an Afghan equivalent for the Army Corps of Engineers, but they lost $20 million of heavy equipment in the process. There was $28 million worth of uniforms that are missing. Someone got paid. We can't find the uniforms. We can't prove that anyone ever got the uniforms. Even more troubling than that, there was $700,000 worth of ammunition missing. You'd think we could at least keep up with ammunition. You think that might be a danger and insult to our young men and women we send to Afghanistan, that we can't account for where the ammunition is? I think if you can't account for it, there's a decent chance that the enemy has your ammunition. Or rogue elements in the Afghan government, which could be anyone, has sold it on the black market to make money. Where does your money go? I want you to realize as Americans where your money's going. $500,000 to study if selfies make you happier. So you take selfies of yourself smiling and then you look at them to see if that makes you happier. Now, you may want to do this on your own time, but $500,000 of taxpayer money when we're $1 trillion short, this stuff's been going on with the National Science Foundation since the 70s. William Proxmire was a senator back in the 70s, a conservative Democrat or a Democrat of some stripe, and he used to do the Golden Fleece Award. And many of them came from the National Science Foundation in like 1972. He complained about it for 10 years before he retired. I've been complaining about it for 6 years. What do the Republicans and the Democrats do? Oh, it's science. You wouldn't know, sir, about science. We have to give them more money. You're not smart enough to know there's a lot of science in taking selfies. And we could learn something really important that's so important for the future of mankind, to learn whether or not selfies of people smiling will make you, help the world in the end. NIH, everybody loves NIH and they can do no wrong. NIH did a $2 million study to see whether or not the people who sneeze on your food in front of you, if you're following somebody in the cafeteria line and the guy or the woman in front of you sneezes on the food, are you more or less likely to take the food? Really? I think we could have polled the audience on that. I mean, how ridiculous is that? Money like that, particularly when there are things the government needs to do, and there's $1 trillion deficit, that we spend $2 million studying what your reaction is to people sneezing on the food? $356,000 was spent of your money studying whether or not Japanese quail are more sexually promiscuous on cocaine. These guys have some great studies. This is, once again, I believe, National Science Foundation. Hooray for the National Science Foundation. I know I'm going to get some hate mail from them. $356,000 to study whether Japanese quail are more sexually promiscuous on cocaine. You can't make this stuff up. And yet, the reform that I have proposed is that we have a taxpayer advocate on the committee to determine who gets these grants. And you know what they say? Oh, we can't have any non-scientists. They wouldn't understand the science. All right, I want the scientist who did this to come forward and explain to me why we need to do this study. But there is no point to us spending this money. There could have been something better. So I've offered one thing to try to fix it. Taxpayer advocate on the committee approving grants, and I think we should have a scientist who isn't in that field. So this is sort of behavioral science for Japanese quail, I guess. And so we need to have somebody on there who studies diabetes, heart disease, cancer, AIDS, some of the diseases that affect more people. They need to be on the committee because they need to be scratching their head saying, we could spend it on Japanese quail and their sexual habits, or we could spend it on diabetes. And then the taxpayer advocate could be saying, we could spend it on Japanese quail, or maybe we could reduce the debt. Maybe both could happen. Maybe we could reduce the debt and try to do only better scientific projects. This one looks like something you'd really want your government to spend money on. $150,000 was spent to investigate supernatural events in Alaska. They were to look at unexplained lights, animals with transformative powers, yetis, and all kinds of different mythological animals. landscape features that had special powers, and of course, you wouldn't want to leave out sea monsters. So $150,000, when people say, what's $150,000? You know when they say that, that's the problem of government. Milton Friedman had it right when he said, nobody spends somebody else's money as wisely as their own. Why does nobody care about the $150,000? Because it wasn't their money to spend. And this is really the problem of government at large and why government is never any good at anything they do. They're terribly ineffective because they're spending someone else's money. It doesn't mean we'd have no government, but it means government should be so small that they have less room to make errors like this. We should devolve most of the power of this place back to the states. That's what our founding fathers intended. And we should try to say, we're not going to tolerate this kind of stuff. This is $250,000 that was spent to send 24 kids from Pakistan to Space Camp and Dollywood. So my first question would be asking, is there anybody in America that didn't get to go to Dollywood or Space Camp last year? I think when everybody in America is gone, then we might consider sending some Pakistani kids. But really, frankly, there's nothing in the Constitution that says we should be sending Pakistani kids to Dollywood. Now, there's nothing wrong if you want to send some kids from Pakistan to Dollywood and you've got extra money, by all means, give it to them. But you can't take and should not take the taxpayer money to do things like this. Can I ask the chair how much time I have remaining of my 45 minutes?
19 minutes.
Thank you. This is here in Washington. It's about a mile from here. We call it a streetcar named Waste. $1.6 million to study the expansion of the D.C. streetcar. And this is a streetcar that nobody's actually riding on. If you ever see it, it's the ghost car. There's nobody on it. It also goes nowhere. It goes about a mile from nowhere to nowhere, and it's much slower than walking. Because I've walked and I can outwalk. We've thought about actually filming me in a race with the streetcar to see who wins, me walking or it driving. But really, once again, you know, going back to some technology from hundreds of years ago that still requires, wires to be running down the street and added, it really is not a useful, expensive government money. And D.C. gets a lot of federal money. Where else do you spend your money? Oh, this is one of my favorites. This, I just can't even imagine who spent this money. And do you think, when I tell you, you'll say, well, certainly that person was fired. No way. He works for the federal government. Nobody is ever fired in the federal government. $700,000 spent to study what Neil Armstrong said when he landed on the moon. Did he say one small step for man, one giant leap for mankind, or did he say one small step for a man? They wanted to study whether the preposition a was mentioned by Neil Armstrong or whether he said one small step for man. $700,000. Where did the money come from? The grant was originally supposed to be for autism. Now, we can debate whether the federal government should be involved in that, but it certainly sounds like a much more just study if it had something to do with autism than studying Neil Armstrong's statement on the moon. You can't make this stuff up. This is incredibly ridiculous, but it should be insulting. There should not be a taxpayer at home in America who says, all right, today they're going to vote on a budget to cut 1 penny out of every dollar. We spent $700 grand on what Neil Armstrong did or did not say on the moon. And you know what their conclusion at the end was? They don't know. It was just, it's inconclusive. They listened to the tape over and over and over again. Someone should be fired, but it also should be a message to our body that we should cut some spending. Instead, we've done the opposite. Under Republican control of the Senate and the House, we busted the budget caps by $300 billion just 2 months ago. So part of what my plan would do would be to restore the caps. They're put in place for a reason, to try to control our proclivities to spend too much money. So we put the budget caps in place, and then we cut 1% a year, about $30 billion every year for 5 years, and then we'll let government begin to grow again at about 1%. I know we could live within our means. What would happen is this guy would be fired, and that kind of study would not happen where they have 1% less. Or maybe a program like the National Science Foundation would get 50% less or 75% less to really put them on notice that we're tired after 30 years of crazy research of them continuing without reform. This was also spent in Afghanistan. This is your money. $850,000 to set up a televised cricket league. First problem, most people don't have TVs in Afghanistan. You know, really, we're a televised cricket league? They don't even have TVs to watch it on. $850,000 to make them feel better about their National Cricket League. Boondoggle. Nothing to do with national defense, makes us weaker by putting us further into debt. Will this get better if we continue to increase money? No, it only gets worse. If you give them more money, they will spend it. In fact, we have studied spending at the end of the year. When you get to the end of the year, the government spends money 4 to 5 times faster than any other month in the year. In fact, the last 30 days of the fiscal year, spending increases every day. In fact, on the last day of the fiscal year, you can watch spending accelerating as the sun sets in the west. As offices begin to close in the east, the spending shifts to the Midwest. As the sun sets farther in the western sky and the offices are still open in California, they're spending money as fast as they can because if they don't spend it, they won't get it next year. Use it or lose it. It's a phenomenon of government that's been going on forever. This kind of stuff happens. As long as you give them more money, they'll do it. As long as they're rewarded for doing the spending, we should be studying which agencies do it. We should study which agencies go to Las Vegas and have their conference there for $1 million and they're sipping champagne in the hot tub. That agency should get less money. I think those people actually did get fired, one of the few people ever fired. Next. Now, we can have a debate on another occasion about climate change, but we ought to really probably agree that a $450,000 app for your phone so you can play a climate change game that will, I guess, attempt to convince you and ensure that you're convinced that we are having climate change, $450,000 for an app on a phone. Apps are everywhere. People are developing them all the time. The government doesn't need to be spending what probably somebody spends $1,000 in their garage to develop for $450,000. Remember Obamacare when they tried to set up the website, millions of dollars, and then it failed? Remember the IRS just 3 weeks ago failing? You know, we need to be very careful about giving government more money. The budget that I'm producing is called the penny plan budget. Cuts 1 penny out of every dollar. This is important for the country to see that we're having this vote. They're not that excited to have this vote. We're only having this vote because the Senate rules basically mandate it. The vote can't be avoided because Republicans didn't create a budget, Democrats didn't create a budget. So I decided, what the heck, I'll create my own budget. And the penny plan budget has come forward. If we were to pass this, there are many good things. Through a simple majority, we could do many good things that conservative Republicans have wanted. Make the tax cuts permanent. Get rid of more regulations. Do the REINS Act, which would be to say that new regulations that are very expensive have to be voted on by Congress. We should cut out more waste. There are all kinds of things we could do. What we've chosen to do in our budget is actually give instructions to expand health savings accounts. One of the big problems we have in health care is rising costs. Costs are going up at about 25% a year. The answer around here has been I think lame, uneducated, ill-informed, and counterproductive. Other than that, you know, they're right on target. But what they've tried to do is they said, oh, your individual rate's going up 25% a year. Here's some money so you can pay for it. Well, it does nothing to do to bring the curve down. In fact, it may accelerate the curve. If you subsidize something, it'll become more expensive. You're subsidizing the demand for it. Instead, what we ought to do is expand health savings accounts where people pay for their health care. And people say, I don't want to pay for my health care. When you pay, when you have skin in the game, you ask the price of things. When the government pays or somebody else pays, you don't ask the price of things and the price rises. Competition is the fundamental aspect of capitalism, but you have to have freely fluctuating prices, which we don't in Medicare, Medicaid, and actually mostly private insurance. So really, we've never, ever addressed the fundamental problem of health care, which is we don't have capitalism in health care. And so what do? Because we don't have enough capitalism, we take more capitalism away and add more government, and it's even more broken since we've done Obamacare. But one of the answers, since many Republicans now won't vote to repeal Obamacare, one of the answers is this. Let's try to start expanding the marketplace. My budget today could pass. If every Republican voted for it, it passes. We could move on to doing something like expanding health savings accounts. And this gets to an argument that is sort of an inside baseball argument that happens in Washington. They'll tell you, young man, you must vote for our budget because the budget is simply a vehicle to do other good things. And I look back at them and say, if it's a vehicle and you don't care what's in it, why don't we put something good in it? We always put something crappy in it that never works, never balances, and does not represent who we are as a party, and they shove it down our throat and they say, vote for it, but you have to do it because that's the only way we can get to a tax cut. That's the only way we can get to repeal Obamacare. That's why they're not really for that anymore anyway. But the thing is they could do it by voting for something they actually are for. Everybody in our caucus is for the balanced budget amendment. If we put it forward on the floor, they'll all vote for it. But there won't be enough votes for it to be law, so it's a free vote. This would be the actual platform, the actual symbol of what we run on and what we do next year. And yet we won't have a chance to do that unless they're willing to do it. So they want the budget to be meaningless. They want it to be a vehicle, but then they want it to be their meaningless symbol. And I can't do that. I think there has to be somebody left in the Republican Party who says enough's enough. We're going to not tolerate the waste, the spending, and the debt. And we're going to say the same things we did to President Obama, that big government spending and debt are wrong. And so I don't think we should change just because we're in power. You know, when the Republican Party is out of power, they are the conservative party. The problem is when the Republican Party is in power, there is no conservative party. So what I'm arguing for today is we should be who we say we are. And so I argue for a yes vote on the penny plan budget, and I'll reserve the remainder of my time. If I could have an update of what I have left.
9 minutes.
Perfect. Thank you.